In the early years of the Nazi movement, long before the world understood the scale of the horror to come, a small group of men stood quietly at the edges of power. They were not yet feared. They were not yet an army. They were bodyguards, hand-picked, loyal, and utterly devoted to one man, Adolf Hitler. At first, their role seemed simple: protect the Führer, stand watch at rallies, ensure that no one came close enough to threaten him. But even in those early days, something about this group was different. Unlike the larger, chaotic ranks of the SA, these men were selected with care. Loyalty was not enough. They were expected to embody an idea that would soon grow into something far more dangerous than a protective unit. When Heinrich Himmler took control of the SS in 1929, the transformation began. Himmler was not a battlefield commander. He was something far more methodical, a man obsessed with order, purity, and ideology. Under his leadership, the SS stopped being just a guard unit and became a carefully engineered instrument of belief. Himmler envisioned an elite brotherhood, not just soldiers, but men who saw themselves as racially superior, spiritually bound, and historically destined to reshape the world. Entry into the SS was no longer simple. Recruits were screened for racial purity, their ancestry traced back generations. Physical fitness mattered, but ideology mattered more. These men were not just trained to fight, they were trained to believe. And belief, in this case, was everything. From the moment a recruit entered the SS, his world began to narrow. Training was relentless, not only in weapons and tactics, but in thought. Nazi racial theory was drilled into them. They were taught that they were part of a superior race, that their enemies were not just opponents, but existential threats to civilization itself. Jews, Slavs, political dissidents, these were not seen as human equals, but as obstacles to be removed. Over time, this constant reinforcement began to reshape how these men saw reality. Violence became justified, cruelty became duty, and obedience became absolute. Unlike traditional military units, the SS demanded personal loyalty not to Germany, but directly to Hitler. This distinction was critical. It meant that orders were not to be questioned, even if they defied morality, tradition, or the laws of war. To disobey was not just insubordination, it was betrayal of a sacred oath. As the Nazi regime expanded, so did the SS. What began as a small protective detail grew into a sprawling organization with multiple branches. Among them, one would become particularly infamous: the Waffen-SS. Originally conceived as a combat arm of the SS, the Waffen-SS was meant to stand apart from the regular German army. It was portrayed as an elite force, better trained, more motivated, and more ideologically committed. Recruitment campaigns emphasized honor, brotherhood, and the chance to be part of something greater than oneself. And many believed it. Young men from Germany and across occupied Europe volunteered, drawn by the promise of prestige and purpose. But what they entered was not just a military unit, it was an extension of the SS worldview, a place where ideology and warfare were inseparable. Training in the Waffen-SS pushed recruits to their limits. Physical endurance, weapons mastery, and tactical drills were only part of the process. Just as important was psychological conditioning. Recruits were taught to suppress empathy, to see hesitation as weakness, and to act with ruthless efficiency. They were taught to think of themselves as a new kind of warrior, one who did not fight merely for territory, but for a racial and ideological mission. This mindset would have devastating consequences on the battlefield, because when soldiers are taught that their enemy is less than human, the rules of war begin to disappear. By the time World War II erupted, the SS had already established its identity. It was no longer a shadowy guard unit. It was a powerful, independent force operating alongside and sometimes above the traditional military structure. And its influence extended far beyond the front lines. The SS controlled intelligence networks, ran concentration camps, and enforced Nazi policies across occupied territories. Its members were not just soldiers, they were enforcers of a system built on fear, control, and systematic violence. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the SS was not its structure or its power, it was the mindset it created. Through constant indoctrination, isolation, and reinforcement, SS members were shaped into individuals who saw the world in stark, absolute terms. There was no gray area, only loyalty or betrayal, strength or weakness, purity or corruption. This way of thinking made them incredibly effective in carrying out orders. It also made them capable of acts that shocked even seasoned soldiers from other armies. And yet, within the SS, these actions were not seen as crimes. They were seen as necessary, even righteous. As the war intensified, the Waffen-SS gained a reputation for fierce fighting and unbreakable resolve. They were often deployed in the most critical battles, where their willingness to endure heavy losses and fight to the last man made them both valuable and feared. But that same fanaticism also made them unpredictable. Allied forces quickly learned that facing the Waffen-SS was different from facing regular German troops. These were not soldiers who surrendered easily. They fought harder, longer, and often without regard for their own survival. And when they did surrender, there was always a question lingering in the minds of their enemies. Could they be trusted? Because behind the discipline and the uniforms was an ideology that had stripped away something fundamental: compassion. By the later stages of the war, stories began to spread. Stories of massacres, of prisoners executed, of civilians caught in the path of SS operations. Each account added to a growing perception that the SS was not just another military force, but something far more dangerous, something beyond the rules. This reputation didn't appear overnight. It was built step by step, decision by decision, shaped by the very principles that defined the SS from its earliest days. What began as a small group of loyal bodyguards had become a vast ideological machine, a force driven not just by orders, but by belief. And in war, belief can be more powerful and more destructive than any weapon. Because when men are convinced they are fighting for the future of humanity itself, there are few limits to what they are willing to do. And as the world would soon discover, the consequences of that mindset would be devastating.
By the time the war spread across Europe, the SS had already become something far more dangerous than an elite force. Wherever they went, a pattern began to emerge, one that left behind burned villages, mass graves, and a reputation that spread faster than any advancing army. In the East, where the war took on a particularly brutal character, SS units were given tasks that went far beyond conventional combat. Behind the front lines, special SS formations followed the German advance, operating with a chilling level of efficiency. Their mission was not just to secure territory, but to reshape it by force. Entire communities were targeted. Villages suspected of supporting resistance movements were surrounded, their inhabitants gathered, interrogated, and often executed. In many cases, the distinction between combatants and civilians simply disappeared. Women, children, the elderly, no one was automatically spared. What made these actions even more disturbing was how they were carried out. They were not chaotic outbursts of violence. They were organized, documented, and often justified through the very ideology that had been drilled into SS members from the beginning. To them, this was not murder, it was duty. The concept of anti-partisan warfare became one of the most brutal tools used by the SS. In theory, it was meant to eliminate resistance fighters hiding among civilian populations. In practice, it often became an excuse for indiscriminate violence. Entire regions were subjected to collective punishment, where the actions of a few could lead to the deaths of hundreds. And as these operations expanded, so did the scale of destruction. In places like Eastern Europe, SS units worked alongside other Nazi organizations to carry out systematic killings on a massive scale. Forests, fields, and ravines became execution sites. Victims were marched to the edge, forced to dig their own graves, and shot in waves. These massacres were not hidden in the chaos of battle. They were deliberate, methodical, and repeated over and over again. Word of these atrocities began to spread. At first, many soldiers on the Allied side found it difficult to believe the stories. War always produces rumors, exaggerations, and propaganda. But as the conflict continued, more evidence began to surface. Survivors told their stories, liberated areas revealed the aftermath, and gradually, disbelief turned into grim acceptance. The SS was not just fighting a war, it was waging a campaign of terror. In Western Europe, the pattern continued, though often in different forms. When resistance movements intensified, SS units responded with harsh reprisals. Hostages were taken and executed. Entire towns were punished for acts they may not have even supported. One of the most infamous examples occurred in occupied France, where an SS division carried out a massacre that shocked even hardened observers. Civilians were rounded up, separated, and killed in a coordinated act of violence that left an entire community destroyed. Incidents like this were not isolated. They were part of a broader approach that prioritized control through fear. For Allied soldiers, these actions changed everything. At the beginning of the war, German troops were generally viewed as professional soldiers, opponents but still bound by certain rules. The SS, however, began to stand apart. Reports described units that fought with unusual aggression, showed little regard for surrender protocols, and were linked again and again to atrocities. This created a growing divide in perception. To many Allied troops, encountering the SS meant facing an enemy who did not play by the same rules. And in war, perception can be just as powerful as reality. Stories circulated among frontline units. Some spoke of prisoners being executed after capture. Others described civilians being used as human shields or entire areas being cleared with ruthless efficiency. Each story reinforced the same idea. The SS was different, and that difference had consequences. As battles intensified, especially on the Eastern Front and later in Western Europe, Allied troops began to approach engagements with SS units differently. There was less expectation of surrender, less trust when it was offered, and more fear of what might happen if they hesitated, because hesitation in this kind of war could be fatal. The reputation of the Waffen-SS on the battlefield played a role. They were known for their determination, often holding positions longer than expected and launching counterattacks even in desperate situations. This made them formidable opponents, but it also made encounters more deadly. When one side is seen as unwilling to surrender, the other side may stop expecting it. And when both sides begin to think that way, the space for mercy starts to disappear. By the later years of the war, the SS had become synonymous with brutality in the minds of many Allied soldiers. This perception was not created by propaganda alone. It was reinforced by direct experience, by what soldiers saw in their own eyes in liberated areas, and by what they heard from civilians who had lived under SS control. The line between soldier and criminal in the case of the SS became increasingly blurred. And as that line blurred, so did the rules. Because war is not just fought with weapons, it is fought with emotions, fear, anger, hatred, and the desire for justice. When those emotions are fueled by repeated exposure to extreme violence, they can change how soldiers think, how they react, and ultimately, how they treat their enemy. By the time Allied forces pushed deeper into Nazi-occupied territory, many had already formed a clear conclusion about the SS. They were not just another part of the German military. They were something else entirely. A force that had built its identity on ideology, enforced it through violence, and left behind a trail of destruction that was impossible to ignore. And as this reputation solidified, it set the stage for what would come next. Because when an enemy is seen not just as a threat, but as a symbol of cruelty itself, the idea of mercy becomes much harder to hold on to.
By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical turning point. Allied forces were pushing toward Germany, and the Nazi regime, desperate to regain momentum, launched one last major offensive in the West. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a brutal, chaotic clash fought in freezing forests and snow-covered villages. Amid this offensive, one event would leave a permanent mark on how Allied soldiers viewed the SS. It began on December 17th near a small Belgian crossroads close to the town of Malmedy. American troops, many of them young and relatively inexperienced, had been caught off guard by the speed of the German advance. Surrounded and outnumbered, a group of U.S. soldiers surrendered to an advancing Waffen-SS unit. What happened next would echo across the battlefield. The prisoners were gathered into an open field, disarmed and guarded by SS troops. There was no immediate sign of violence, no indication of what was about to unfold. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted. Machine guns tore through the unarmed prisoners. Men fell in seconds. Some were killed instantly. Others were wounded, lying in the snow, pretending to be dead as SS soldiers moved among them. Survivors would later recall hearing footsteps followed by single gunshots, executions carried out at close range to ensure no one was left alive. This was the Malmedy Massacre. Against all odds, a handful of soldiers managed to escape. They fled through the freezing terrain, carrying with them the story of what had happened. When they reached Allied lines and told their account, the reaction was immediate and explosive. At first, there was shock, then anger, and finally, something more dangerous, a shift. News of the massacre spread rapidly among American units. It moved from command posts to frontline trenches, from whispered conversations to open warnings. Soldiers began to hear the same message over and over again. SS troops had executed prisoners. Surrender was no longer a guarantee of survival. Whether every detail was fully understood in that moment did not matter. What mattered was the impact. Trust was broken. Before Malmedy, surrender, while not always certain, was still part of the battlefield reality. Soldiers on both sides understood that laying down arms could mean survival. After Malmedy, that assumption began to collapse, at least when it came to the SS. Because if one side no longer honored surrender, why should the other? This question did not stay theoretical for long. As the fighting continued in the Ardennes, encounters between Allied troops and Waffen-SS units grew even more intense. Reports circulated that SS soldiers sometimes used deception, approaching under the pretense of surrender, only to open fire when the opportunity presented itself. Whether these incidents were widespread or isolated, they reinforced an already growing belief: the enemy could not be trusted. And in war, belief shapes behavior. American soldiers, many of whom had already endured weeks of brutal combat in harsh winter conditions, now carried something else with them into battle, a sense that they were facing an enemy outside the accepted rules, an enemy that had crossed a line. For some, this led to a hardening of attitudes. Orders were not always written down, policies were not always officially declared, but on the ground, among men who had seen friends killed and heard the stories from Malmedy, a different kind of understanding began to take hold. Be careful with prisoners, especially if they wore the SS uniform. Because the uniform itself had become a symbol, not just of allegiance to Nazi Germany, but of a specific kind of warfare, one that blurred the boundaries between combat and execution, between soldier and enforcer. When Allied troops encountered regular Wehrmacht units, the response might be cautious, but it was often measured. When they encountered the SS, it was different. There was tension, there was suspicion, and sometimes there was no hesitation at all.
The psychological impact of Malmedy cannot be overstated. It did more than take lives. It changed expectations. It introduced the idea that surrender might be a trap, that mercy could be exploited, and that hesitation could cost everything. For soldiers already operating under extreme stress, this shift had profound consequences. Because in the chaos of battle, decisions are made in seconds. There is no time for investigation, no opportunity to verify intentions. A raised hand could mean surrender or deception. A moment of compassion could lead to death. Faced with that uncertainty, many chose the safer option, or at least the option that felt safer in that moment. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the lines between retaliation and survival began to blur. Incidents occurred where SS prisoners were not taken, where the memory of Malmedy hung over the battlefield like a shadow, influencing actions in ways that were rarely spoken about openly. And it wasn't just American forces. Other Allied units, hearing the same stories, witnessing similar patterns, began to adopt a more cautious, sometimes harsher approach when dealing with SS troops. The idea spread beyond a single battlefield, becoming part of a broader perception that would persist until the end of the war. The SS had built its reputation over years of brutality. At Malmedy, that reputation reached a breaking point. From that moment on, the possibility of mercy was no longer assumed. It had to be earned. And for many SS soldiers, it never was. Because once trust is destroyed in war, it is almost impossible to rebuild. And in the frozen fields of Belgium, on that December day in 1944, something fundamental had changed. Not just in strategy, not just in morale, but in how soldiers saw each other. And once that shift happens, the war itself becomes something darker, something far more unforgiving, something where surrender is no longer a guarantee of survival.
By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. Allied armies were advancing deep into Germany, encountering less organized resistance, but something far more disturbing in its place. As towns fell and front lines collapsed, soldiers began to discover sites that had been hidden for years, places that revealed the true scale of what the SS had been part of. At first, there were only rumors, whispers from civilians, fragments of stories from escaped prisoners, reports that seemed too horrific to be real. Many soldiers dismissed them, or at least struggled to fully grasp what they meant. War was already brutal. How much worse could it be? Then the gates began to open. One of the first major shocks came with the liberation of Dachau Concentration Camp. American troops approaching the area were not prepared for what they were about to see. Even before entering the camp, there were signs. Rail cars filled with bodies left abandoned on the tracks. The smell alone was enough to make it clear that something was terribly wrong. When soldiers moved inside, the reality became unavoidable. Rows of barracks filled with emaciated prisoners, survivors so weak they could barely stand. Piles of bodies stacked in corners, evidence of mass death on a scale that defied comprehension. These were not casualties of battle. These were victims of a system, one that had been carefully managed, enforced, and protected. And many of the men responsible for that system wore the uniform of the SS. For the soldiers who witnessed this, the experience was not just shocking, it was transformative. Up until that moment, the war had been about defeating an enemy army. Now it became something else entirely, a confrontation with what that enemy had done. Accounts from those present describe a mix of disbelief, horror, and overwhelming anger. Some soldiers tried to help the survivors immediately, offering food and medical aid. Others walked through the camp in silence, struggling to process what they were seeing. And then there were those who encountered the guards. SS personnel who had been responsible for running the camp were still present when Allied forces arrived. Some attempted to surrender, others tried to blend in, discarding uniforms or claiming they had no role in the atrocities. But the evidence was everywhere. It surrounded them. And for many Allied soldiers, that made the situation clear. These were not just enemy troops, these were perpetrators. What followed has remained one of the most controversial and emotionally charged aspects of the war's final days. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, there were instances where SS guards were executed on the spot. These actions were not part of official policy. They were not formally ordered. They were reactions, raw, immediate responses to what had just been uncovered. The line between justice and revenge became dangerously thin. Some soldiers later described feeling that conventional rules no longer applied in that moment. The scale of suffering they had just witnessed made it difficult, if not impossible, to treat captured SS personnel as ordinary prisoners of war. The idea of extending protection to those associated with such crimes felt, to some, like a betrayal of the victims they had just seen. It is important to understand the context, but also the complexity. Not every Allied soldier reacted the same way. Many followed established procedures, taking prisoners and securing the area. Commanders, once aware of what had happened, often moved quickly to restore order and prevent further unauthorized actions. But the fact remains that in those first moments, before structure returned, before investigations began, there were decisions made that reflected the emotional intensity of the situation. And it wasn't only in Dachau. As Allied forces advanced across Germany and into other liberated territories, similar scenes unfolded. Camps were discovered, survivors were found. Evidence of systematic abuse, starvation, and execution was revealed again and again. Each discovery reinforced the same realization. This was not isolated. It was widespread. It was organized, and it had been allowed to continue for years. The role of the SS in this system became impossible to ignore. They were not just soldiers on a battlefield. They were administrators, guards, and enforcers of a network designed to control, exploit, and eliminate entire groups of people. For many Allied troops, this changed the nature of the enemy completely. Because how do you respond when the war is no longer just about territory or strategy, but about confronting crimes on an almost unimaginable scale? Some responded with restraint, others did not. In the days following these liberations, military leadership began to emphasize the importance of discipline and adherence to the laws of war. Investigations were launched into incidents where prisoners had been killed. There was a recognition that even in the extreme provocation, certain standards had to be maintained. But enforcing those standards in the immediate aftermath of such discoveries was not always easy. The emotional impact lingered. Soldiers who had walked through the camps carried those images with them. It influenced how they saw the SS, how they interpreted surrender, and how they reacted in future encounters. The idea that some enemies might not deserve mercy, whether justified or not, became more deeply rooted. And so, as the war approached its final weeks, the dynamic on the battlefield had shifted once again. The SS, already feared for their fanaticism and brutality, were now directly associated in the minds of many with the machinery of mass suffering that had just been exposed. Their uniform no longer represented just an enemy combatant. It represented something far more disturbing, something personal, something that could not be easily separated from the horrors that had just been uncovered. In that environment, decisions were rarely simple. The liberation of the camps marked a turning point, not only in how the world understood the Nazi regime, but in how soldiers on the ground understood their role in ending it.
because once you have seen the consequences of that system up close, the war stops being abstract. It becomes immediate. And the question of how to treat those who enforced it becomes one of the most difficult and controversial issues of the entire conflict.
By the final weeks of the war in Europe, the Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines were shattered, and entire units were retreating or surrendering in chaos. For many German soldiers, the goal was no longer victory, it was survival. But for members of the SS, survival was far more complicated. Unlike regular Wehrmacht troops, SS men carried something that could not easily be discarded. It wasn't just their uniform, it was their identity, one that had been built, reinforced, and ultimately marked in ways that made hiding almost impossible. One of the most revealing details was the blood type tattoo. Typically placed under the left arm, this small marking indicated a soldier's blood group. It was originally intended for medical purposes, allowing for faster treatment in the event of injury, but by the end of the war it had become something else entirely, a permanent identifier. Even if an SS soldier removed his uniform, even if he claimed to be a regular infantryman, that tattoo could expose him instantly. Allied troops learned to look for it. As Germany's defenses crumbled, thousands of soldiers attempted to surrender to advancing Allied forces. Many hoped to be treated as ordinary prisoners of war. Some SS members tried to blend in with regular units, discarding insignia, altering uniforms, or simply denying their affiliation. But suspicion was everywhere. Allied soldiers, shaped by years of brutal fighting, stories of atrocities, and first-hand experiences in liberated areas, had developed a different perspective when it came to the SS. The uniform alone was often enough to trigger caution. The tattoo made denial nearly impossible. And once identified, the outcome could be very different. In many cases, SS prisoners were separated from other German troops. They were interrogated more aggressively, guarded more closely, and viewed not just as enemy soldiers, but as potential perpetrators of crimes. The assumption, fair or not, was that anyone who had served in the SS had been part of something far beyond conventional warfare. For some, that assumption led to immediate consequences. There were instances, especially in the chaotic final days of the war, where SS soldiers were executed shortly after capture. These actions were not consistent, nor were they officially sanctioned across the board, but they did happen, shaped by a combination of fear, anger, and a desire for justice or revenge. And it wasn't only Allied troops. In occupied countries that were now being liberated, civilians and resistance fighters also encountered retreating SS units. These populations had lived under occupation, witnessed violence, and in many cases lost family members or entire communities. When the balance of power shifted, some took matters into their own hands. Captured SS men were sometimes handed over to authorities. Other times they were not. The collapse of central authority in certain areas created moments where formal justice systems had not yet been restored. In those gaps, actions were driven by memory, by loss, and by years of suppressed anger finally finding release. For SS members, there was nowhere to hide. Even surrender did not guarantee safety. Even compliance did not erase suspicion. The very organization they had belonged to, once a source of pride and power, had become a mark that followed them to the end. But as the war concluded and order slowly returned, a different process began to take shape. Investigations, trials, an effort to move from battlefield reactions to structured accountability. The world would soon witness the Nuremberg trials, where leading figures of the Nazi regime were brought before an international tribunal. Evidence was presented, testimonies were heard, and for the first time, the full scope of what had been done began to be formally documented and judged. The SS, as an organization, was declared criminal.
This decision carried enormous weight. It meant that membership alone could be grounds for prosecution, depending on the circumstances. It reinforced the idea that the SS had not just participated in isolated acts of violence, but had been a central instrument in a system of widespread and systematic crimes. For many survivors and victims, these trials represented a form of justice, imperfect but necessary. For historians and observers, they raised difficult questions. Where is the line between responsibility and obedience? How much blame belongs to the individual and how much to the system that shaped them? And perhaps most controversially, how should soldiers who acted outside the law in response to SS crimes be judged? These questions remain debated to this day, because the final chapter of the SS is not just about their defeat, it is about the legacy they left behind, a legacy that forced the world to confront the limits of warfare, the dangers of ideology, and the consequences of dehumanizing an enemy. In the end, the fate of many SS soldiers reflected the very system they had helped uphold, a system where mercy was often absent, a system where identity defined destiny, and a system that once exposed made it nearly impossible for those associated with it to escape judgment, whether on the battlefield, at the hands of civilians, or in a court of law. As the guns fell silent in 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. But the questions it raised did not. Because understanding what happened is not just about looking back, it is about recognizing how easily lines can be crossed, how quickly beliefs can be weaponized, and how, in the most extreme circumstances, even the idea of justice itself can become complicated. And in that complexity lies the true legacy of those final days.